Winkles, yeah. details. Next month is a talk about the history of the evangelical movement in Toronto by Greg
Close the back.
Cresswell,
Close the back there. That.
who is the longest guy without membership ever, because of being just so used to being here. I just forgot he wasn't a member.
All right. That's.
Which one? There, perfect.
All right. One more. I guess. Everything working?
Can you see okay like that, Jordan? Is that
Yeah.
okay? Or?
I can see.
Yeah.
I've got a light that goes on.
Turn it on?
You might? Oh, yeah, I have to press the button.
All right.
Thank you. All right. Is it working? Good, good. And this should be good.
All right, short hair.
Okay, maybe. That's true. Maybe not much. All right, so today I'm going to be doing a talk on New Age movement and witchcraft. So this particular talk, I was interested in the topic of the New Age for quite some time. And I brought this interest up, and I wanted to get a new church perspective on this particular group. So I asked Mr. Reverend Michael Cowley, and he provided me with a very interesting document that basically goes really in depth about this particular topic. And so that's just a little bit of history about it, and so now I'll get right into the presentation. So I'm going to start this presentation with just a quote that I hope you guys can remember throughout the presentation. So this quote is from Ephesians, and it goes, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So to start the topic, we're going to look at this lady here, and her name is Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She was born in 1831 and died in 1891. And she played a major role in influencing the New Age movement. She wrote a 600-page book called The Secret Doctrine, and I've not read it, but this particular book deals with a lot of different subjects, and it's quite complicated, and to get into it, it's I don't know. But essentially, a lot of her ideas, which were Eastern ideas that she brought to the West, influenced the New Age. And a person who actually articulated these ideas slightly easier to understand was a guy named Alan Watts. So Alan Watts, he was also known for bringing Eastern philosophies over to a Western audience. And I'm going to read you this rather long quote, but there's a reason behind it. This particular quote basically is how some people are introduced to certain ideas of the New Age. And by me reading this, you'll get an understanding as to the appeal of some of these ideas and how people can come across them. So the quote starts, "If you awaken from this illusion and you understand that black implies white, self implies other, and life implies death, you can feel yourself not as a stranger in this world, but not as something here on probation, not as something that has arrived here by fluke, but you can begin to feel your own existence as absolutely fundamental." I'm not trying to sell you on this idea in the sense of converting you to it. I want you to play with it. I want you to think of its possibilities. I'm not trying to prove it to you. I'm just putting it forward as a possibility of life to think about. So then, let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream that you wanted. And you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time, or any length of time that you wanted to have. And you would naturally, as you began on this adventure of dreams, you would fulfill your wishes. You would have every kind of pleasure you could conceive. And after several nights of 75 years of total pleasure, each you would say, well, that was pretty great, but now let's have a surprise. Let's have a dream which isn't under control, where something is going to happen to me, but I don't know what it's going to be. And you would dig that and would come out at the end and you would say, wow, that was close. That was a close save, wasn't it? Then you would get more and more adventurous and you would make further and further out gambles about what you would dream. And finally, you would dream the dream that you're having now. You would dream you would dream the dream of living the life that you're actually living today. So this particular idea, it's rather long, but the idea that he's actually playing with is the idea that you are a god. That's basically the idea that he's playing with. And that God basically essentially got bored and decided to dream, and that throughout these dreams, he decided to take away his free will to make it more interesting, and so therefore everybody's a god or something like that. So that's basically this particular idea, that one idea that's common to the New Age. So in this particular, in the document that was written by Patrick A. Rose, and the document, by the way, is entitled Magic and the Occult, and it was written in 1995. These are some of the 5 basic ideas that he associates with the New Age movement. He says that all is one, all reality is part of the whole. Man can create his own reality through transformed consciousness. Man never dies, but continues to live through reincarnation. Everything is God, and God is everything. And lastly, that man is God. So these are some of the ideas that he basically outlines after having looked at this. He has like a bunch of references from the writings and from New Age writers, and these are his basic conclusions. So the basic idea here is that of a sort of evolution, and that's kind of why I brought this picture up. And the New Age, they don't necessarily call this an evolution, they call it a transformation of consciousness. And the idea is that man kind of starts as the monkey over there, and that after enough time and through enough enlightenment of a person's consciousness, they can become that person to the rightmost, which is essentially a god. All of their chakras have been opened, they have this light above them representing enlightenment, and they are now a supreme type of being. And funnily enough, another thing that's mentioned here in the document is that one form of the New Age group is, there's different forms. So some people are just interested in crystals, some people are interested in meditation, yoga, and then there's other types that are more interested in contacting spirits, types of yoga that have to do with summoning deities. In particular, there's one type of yoga called Kundalini yoga, which when you look it up, there's an image of a serpent at the base of a person's spine. And the idea is that the serpent, over enough time, will ravel through these different energy points in a person's being, represented by those different circles, and that once the serpent gets to the head of a person, then the person will start having seizures and going crazy, and that this is an increased their awareness and state of consciousness. To me, it sounds a little bit like possession, but so this basic idea that we shall be as gods has a beginning in Genesis, and it's basically the same lie that the serpent told to Adam and Eve, which was that if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will become a god. In the New Age movement, they paraphrase it to say that if you have a transformation of consciousness, you can be a god. But it's the same idea that knowledge, gnosis, leads to enlightenment and becoming a god. So this particular image here has to do with, one of the things that I stumbled across when looking at this is that the New Age movement kind of overlaps with the idea of certain kinds of magic, witchcraft, and possession and stuff like this. And so looking into this, the document covers if this kind of stuff is still possible, what's his perspective on it. And I guess I took this picture because it serves a purpose in explaining how certain things could still be possible, but kind of be without or above our understanding. So to this monkey who's watching the TV, everything that he sees in the TV, to an extent, looks real. Now, if he was to go to the side of the screen, like I go to the side of this screen, then there's nothing there. But to the monkey, it appears as though everything is in the screen, and he can't really understand. So to him, this is a form of magic. But just because the monkey doesn't understand which laws and order is applying or being applied doesn't mean that it's magic. It's just that it's using a higher form of knowledge than he has the ability to access at that given point in time, and so it looks miraculous. And I guess that would be the same thing I would say with modern magic as well, is that it can, I'll get further into that as the talk continues. So, looking at magic, in the document, it talks about the birthplace of magic, and he has a couple quotes from Swedenborg that kind of back him up on this. And he says that basically the birthplace of magic was Egypt. And so now I'm going to start reading some excerpts from the document. So the practice of magic in the spiritual, oh no, wrong one. Where is it? All right. I'm going to skip a few because I don't know why I can't. Wait, page 9. All right. Can't find the exact quote, so I'll just try and paraphrase from memory. The basic idea is that the Egyptians had certain kinds of, there's a special word for it, something kinds of knowledges, and that these knowledges were collected inside of Egypt, and that their knowledge of correspondences allowed them to practice magic because they understood that there was, that it's like whenever you hear of like potions and witchcraft and stuff like that, usually it's always some crazy combination of like eye of left cat and like frog leg, I don't know. And so when you think about the recipes from a rational point of view, it doesn't make any sense. It's just going to be one very disgusting smoothie. But when you look at it from a correspondential view, then these recipes can, I guess, make sense. I haven't really looked at them, but I assume that they would make sense according to correspondences. Okay. All right. So, all right. So, the practice of magic in the spiritual world. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Now we're going on a slight segue to look at what Patrick Rose has to say about magic in the spiritual world. So, just what is involved is seen clearly in one technique acquired by a magician in the other world, that of appearing in a spiritual place where they are not, and so counterfeiting a universal presence. Since location in the other world depends upon one's state, if someone is skilled at simulating states, or of pretending to be honorable when he is wicked, for example, then in the other world he can produce the fallacy of being somewhere else other than where he actually is. This is just one example. By using various correspondences and representatives, the magicians of the other world can simulate various states, induce various states on others, deceive and torment in a multitude of ways. They use various facial expressions and bodily gestures, yoga. Where was I? Darn it. And bodily gestures, and magical symbols, rods and wands to accomplish their evil ends. They have power to do such things, become invisible, inspire others with various affections, so that others come under their power or spell. Feign innocence by conjuring up infants, who they hold and kiss, like politicians, masquerading as others, and so on. So this is just an example of some of the things that spirits in the other world use magic. And so I guess one of the important things to take away from that idea is that magic had its birthplace in, I guess the Egyptians were able to take this knowledge from the spiritual world, but what we're seeing here is that these magicians were all they were trying to make something appear that wasn't true. So they were using deception. And so by that, it seems to have an evil kind of beginning as well. And reading further, so this was an interesting part where basically he makes the point that even today there might still be a risk of certain kinds of magical activity occurring. So he says that it might be argued today that following the Last Judgment, magic no longer is existent, and as it was when the above statements were written. However, Konjunjalov, written after the judgment, speaks of magical seduction, referring to a situation in which, and this is from Konjunjalov 48, some wife is skilled in sorceries, or so exciting a man with potions that a burning heat of flesh deprives his understanding and his freedom of reason. So from this, I guess he's making the argument that at least during the time when he was writing some of his writings, there were certain kinds of magic that were still in use, which is kind of interesting. All right. So going on to what he says about the practice of magic after the Last Judgment. So he says, is magic, and by this we mean real magic, still practiced in the world today? Are there still people as witches that deserve to be put to death, for example? There are certainly many people who claim to be magical practitioners, and we can examine their claims. And then he goes on further, and basically his conclusion is that there are certain types of magic that still do exist. In another passage, he was talking about how, and do I have it? All right, from memory it is. So there was another passage where he was talking about certain types of sirens and how there's these beings in the other world that can kind of infest people, and that when a man has lusting thoughts and he falls in love with these thoughts, that when he passes on, he then is forever tormented by these sirens who he is a slave to for all eternity. Or it says for as long as he's alive, and that basically would mean for eternity. And so that's pretty unpleasant. But where else was I going with this? I guess one of the other interesting ideas is that he talks about how even today, if we were to examine ourselves, and if you were to examine and see, how exactly does it go? It's something like, if all of the worldly restrictions were to be taken off of you, you can actually tell yourself if you are being influenced by one of these kinds of spirits, if these things were to be taken off of you, if you would then commit certain types of acts. And that's actually how to tell if you actually have one of these spirits inside of you. And I thought, wow, that's actually pretty interesting. And I actually saw a video, it was, I think, yesterday. And the video is pretty interesting because it was this pastor in Africa, and there's a guy who's talking, and he comes up out of the crowd, and he's saying all this random stuff. And then the pastor says, like, in the name of Jesus, I rebuke the devil or something. And then he starts actually talking to this demon who's inside of this person. And they're talking, and there's subtitles or whatever so that you can understand what's going on. And basically, he starts asking the demon certain types of questions, like how did this person become possessed? And what I found very interesting is a lot of the stuff that I was reading here and some of the quotes from Swedenborg were lining up with some of the stuff that was being said. So, for example, he was saying, well, we didn't really have license in order to come into this person until there was a conduit. And then he said, what do you mean, what is a conduit? And he said, well, when this person partook in a particular type of sin, then we were given license into his life, and then we started to be able to control. And I thought, and they said, but this person has gone to church. And he says, well, what we do is we wait outside of the church, and then when the conduit happens again, and then he says, in this case, what's the conduit? He says, it's his bad habit. When his bad habit happens again, then we come and jump and attack him even more vigorously than before. And so that was quite interesting and frightening. So that's basically the gist of the talk. I thought it was kind of interesting just hearing about how there's certain things in the New Age movement that are quite similar to certain things that are happening in witchcraft. And the quote at the beginning, which is the idea that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and darkness and whatnot. And the idea there is that everything, I guess, has a spiritual aspect to it, and that sometimes the problems that we face, well, I think every time the problem that we face are always spiritual, and that always by, I guess, seeking out the Lord, we can overcome various problems, no matter how natural they may seem. So that's basically all the ideas. So thank you very much for listening, and yeah.
One example that came to mind when you're talking about Egypt was when Moses did his miracles with his rod, throw it down, became a serpent, picked it up and it became a rod again. And the Egyptian magicians were able to do the same thing. And then he put his hand in, it became leprous, and took it out, put it in again, and the leprosy was gone.
Yeah.
They were able to, I think the first three miracles, they were able to.
So it was the first three plagues. The rod, the water to blood, and then the lice, or the frogs. They could duplicate the frogs.
So they could actually, as you say, do magic that was real in this world.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. Another part I didn't get to talk about, but which was also interesting, was that there was two types of magic, or there was magical miracles. There was like a bunch of different combinations, but they were saying that in the past, the miracles were for the growth of the church, which is why they were able to cast down the rod and have that happen, and that their magic was, I guess, the perversion of what was originally intended for something good. So, any other questions?
But the capper on that is that when Moses put down his rod and it became a serpent, his serpent ate their serpents.
He was more powerful.
Totally. God was more powerful.
Yes.
On that note, another interesting tidbit is that in the Joseph story, it's pretty well known, he hides his cup in his brother's bags, and that's his way of catching them. But an often overlooked detail is that when they're brought back for him, he says, why did you steal my cup in which I practice divination? Or did you not know that a man such as I can surely practice divination? And whether that's true or not, it's what he impressed with them with. I'm a magician. That's how I knew what she did. And obviously in that case it's not, because he planted the cup.
But his wife was the priest's daughter.
That's true.
So he probably had access. Their magic was from knowledge of correspondences. And correspondences have power.
It's just like the movie The Matrix, essentially.
I guess.
Yeah.
You guys.
Just like it. One to
Thank
one.
you, Jordan, for the presentation.
Yes.
Halloween's coming up, and you see spooky things, and a lot of people want to play with this power. A lot of innocent young people want to find out ways in which they can, do magic, because it's so enticing. I remember getting into it and studying it, and having that document was because I was in the ministry, and Patrick presented on that way back when. But raising a family of inquiring minds, especially girls who love magical, mystical things. Not to say boys don't, but trying to answer their questions when they ask questions about the New Age movement, about witchcraft, about yoga, or about Eastern philosophy things. So it's good to have the teachings from the writings addressing that. Patrick's paper, I don't know, what was it, 50 pages long or 60 pages long?
It's quite long.
Quite thorough. And for anybody interested, there's another book called New Thought by a man named Larson from Arizona. I remember seeing that book, and I have a couple copies of it, that again talks about the connection between Swedenborg, because a lot of people read Swedenborg and then come back out of that with all this information, and a lot of plagiarism of Swedenborg's ideas are used in New Thought. A lot of the founders of New Thought movement, you mentioned one, but there are there's like 20 or so names that anybody in the New Thought movement would recognize that all read Swedenborg. So we're on the cusp of that information with what we have in the new church, and it can be easily abused and easily misunderstood. So it's good to see your inquiring mind looking into this and finding ways to approach it. Yoga is an interesting thing, because people, like anything, can become lost in that. My study of it so far has been that it's a very powerful and very useful practice because, from what I understand, in and of itself, it does not espouse doing some of the things that are espoused in some of the practices of either witchcraft or New Age thought. But there is the Kundalini, again, it's on the fringe where people can go into that, becoming more powerful, becoming more connected with the spirits, having this power of the other world. You know, it's very enticing. And I know several people who have basically gone crazy. And I know a couple of suicides that are connected with getting in touch with that, drinking the Kool-Aid, as I say. And it's not a joke, because evil spirits love to possess your mind, obsess your mind, and then get you thinking about the same thing over and over again, etc., etc. And there's magical power. That's the magical power of enchantment spoken about in the writings. A lot of things being repeated in the mind. And evil spirits love to enchant by repetition. Anyway, I don't want to give another whole talk, but thank you so much for looking into that and sharing that with us.
Thank you.
So I recall that Madame Blavatsky, she was the founder of the
Theosophical,
Theosophical Society. And she considered herself to be guided by Tibetan masters who channeled them through her. There was another woman who had a similar claim, who was really quite renowned in the United States by the name of Alice Bailey. And Alice Bailey wrote quite a number of works similar to Madame Blavatsky, I think a little bit more contemporary. But just to give you an idea of how pervasive this idea was, the publishing company that Alice Bailey and her husband founded was called the Lucifer Trust. And then it was subsequently changed its name to the Lucis Trust. And the Lucis Trust is the publisher for most of the documents that come out of the United Nations. And the universal prayer that is said at the UN actually was written by Alice Bailey.
Oh, no way.
So there is a permeance of these ideas into what we might consider, regular or mainstream institutions.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was thinking, so the new church is, the new Christian religion that's bringing about the ideas that I guess were once popular in, I guess, the most ancient church, and that now we're kind of getting those back. And that at the same time as the new church is growing, I was thinking, New Age. There's a New Age religion that is probably standing kind of in contrast, that's also, I don't know. Basically, the idea is that there's this duality, and that perhaps the New Age is on the other side of that duality with the new church. Yes?
Did you look into Scientology at all?
I
don't
know
know a ton about it. Your concept that a lot of New Age thought portrays each of us as essentially divine, and if you just raise your consciousness. And my sort of surface understanding of Scientology is that people that practice it and are serious about it, it's about trying to overcome lower instincts and stuff like that. And it's kind of like reformation in a way, or regeneration, but I think it feels, exactly, self-guided, so it's probably perverted a little bit. But I just wondered if you'd looked into it as a practice, because it seems based on some of these ideas.
I haven't. I have to look into that. It does sound kind of interesting. I've looked into similar things, but not Scientology.
Yeah.
I have a computer, and so I've hopped onto the Wikipedia page on Scientology. And how's this for encyclopedic neutrality? Scientology is a body of religious beliefs and practices invented in May 1952 by American author L. Ron Hubbard.
Absolutely. Somebody challenged a science fiction writer to invent a religion.
Really?
That's where Scientology comes from.
Right.
Okay.
Oh.
invented, not, inspired. from
Discovered
above.
or-
He
Yeah.
sat down at his desk and
Made it up.
made it up, and that's,
Is a challenge.
But it's a powerful, a powerful group, as I understand it. I mean, it's weird. It's
Tom
anyone,
Cruise,
I just-
well-known member.
I think, I'd like to introduce another aspect to the whole subject, not to extend or extrapolate too much, but one of the interesting facets from my jauntings around South America is that you find that witchcraft is fairly prevalent, but it has a different kind of connotation. Like, it's not the superimposition of esoteric philosophy or, sort of ritualistic practices, a fusion or a synthesis of all kinds of different things. It's very, very organic and very rudimentary, and maybe something similar to the way it may appear in Africa.
Very much. It's the Sangorma is someone who allows you to connect with the ancestors for healing.
So there's this idea and a certain reverence towards, I guess, North America, the Aboriginal people would refer to as the shaman.
okay.
They have the sort of Spanishized version of the name, the brujo or the bruja. And, it comes back, to a certain extent, I think, to the tribal nature of the people who lived in those environments. A lot of them have been assimilated, but, their patterns of thinking and approaching and perspectives on the world, didn't just disappear. And, if you had a small group of people living in an area, then the person who would become the leader would be someone who could command a certain aspects of leadership, which would include elements of the command over the supernatural.
Or if not the leader would bring someone like that into as an advisor.
And there's been a lot of study about these people, because this is a system of society that's, millennia of old, right? And, the belief, they would have visions, they would be able to, give direction to the tribe or the clan, they could solve disputes, they could, do various things that would keep the society going. And yet they were, there's one particular study that looked at attributes of the shamanism and so forth and tried to ascribe schizophrenia to it, because of the hallucinations and so forth. But it's pretty hard to imagine how a history of schizophrenics could keep a society together in a leadership
But the
role.
thing is, the schizophrenic often hears voices, which is exactly what we're talking about, is that connection
Yeah.
to the other world.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about, they usually use some peyote or something that would give them
Yeah, and
spiritual awareness.
there is it's in relation to the ancestors and so forth, but it's also, it has to do with healing rituals, right? And, for thousands of years, they stuck with these rituals. It's hard for me to understand that they would do that if there wasn't some power to the whole thing.
Right.
Even if it wasn't, even if we would try to describe it in terms of, placebos and so forth. But, like, the shaman could actually go into your past and find out that your illness is related to some grudge that you had against your brother, and that you need to make peace with your brother in order for the illness to be healed. And they would do that. That was, part of their social cohesion and so forth. So, like, I guess we would call that witchcraft.
Well, medicine.
But it has a certain,
Medicine.
it has a different kind of application.
Well,
It's
if
a
I'm,
lot more organic.
if I'm not mistaken, I think that the word pharmakia or pharmacy comes from sorcery or something like that. Am I right there?
I couldn't tell you about that.
Okay.
I had a related
Google.
point, but I withdrew my hand when that question came up. Yeah, I mean, this is a huge oversimplification based on perhaps not enough study, but now that you're all prepared to believe everything I say. You know, in the most ancient church, you know, from doctrine, in the most ancient church, people really did have regular contact with the spiritual world, and it was a good and orderly thing, because people didn't abuse it. They were ready to have dreams or whatever in which they received insight from the spiritual world. In the ancient church, there was more of a separation where it wasn't, you had to sort of, you didn't just get that same influx from the spiritual world. You had to, that's where rituals were introduced, which were sort of, you could almost say, methods of reactivating, ritualistically reactivating what had happened spontaneously in the previous church. And the ritual was still good. It was calling to mind spiritual things, whether or not it had magical effects. It was sort of reminding people with this complex set of symbolism of spiritual stuff. And that was all fine. And the term magic, at least in the Heavenly Doctrines, is introduced specifically when it starts to be twisted for selfish purposes, which is what you were getting at the beginning when you said it's fundamentally about deception. And so just to go tie in with your point, I think that there's sort of, those two strands of it have sort of been passed down. The you know, witch doctor or shaman or whatever it is, as sort of the preserver of that ancient symbolism, ritualistic symbolism with a semi-magical flavor to it, sort of the person holding spiritual knowledge in a vaguely magical form. And then the person who is using it as a means of personal power. You know, whether they're actually, again, whether it's really having magical effects or not, you define witchcraft as the effort to use spiritual power for personal gain.
Right. Michael, what about your friend, our friend in California, in Arizona, with the looking for the ancient word?
Oh, yeah, I was going to talk
Dr.
a couple, yeah, he passed away, Dr. Bush,
Yeah.
Brush.
Brush.
Yeah, he and Christopher Bound, because there's a statement made in a couple places that talk about the ancient word being found in Greater Tartary. Where is that? So,
He was
Dr.
Yes.
came here?
You gave a talk on that.
Yeah,
It's
so
awesome.
fascinating
Yeah.
subject of chasing after the ancient word. How would you even recognize it if you saw it? Is it, and he came closest to basically saying, is it not that which is within the hands of the shaman of that era or of that area, and they do everything to protect against its abuse. So we weren't being helped, more or less, he was saying. And Chris Bound could talk about it, because was the first name George? No. Right over right. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name. But Dr. Brush, James Brush. Yeah, he's passed away now, but he went a number of times, and he became very, not maybe obsessed, but maybe obsessed with chasing, finding the ancient word, and got grants from the academy or Carpenter or whatever, some grants to do the travel. I remember skipping from that to another subject was in theological school, especially Reverend Heinrichs Willard spent time in Africa and spent time studying the spiritual diary. I think maybe his favorite set of books of the writings, and talked a lot about the fear, the huge fear he had of dabbling with any kind of magical stuff because of his own experience with people being killed by magic. And the writings actually talk about somebody being able with magic to suffocate a person, not with their hands, but with magic. Not by poisoning them with a potion, but with enchanted magic, etc. So it's definitely a real thing, and it's definitely something to be aware of. A lot of it, if I understood him correctly, was if the person involved was able to be believing, then the spirits that were with him would have more power because they would believe what was so magical about whatever was going on. So if you're very skeptical and you don't believe in magic, and your mind's not going to be open to the same kind of manipulation as those who are very superstitious.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the things in the document. It talked about how the Israelites were very external,
Right.
and the Egyptians were very internal, and so they were given, the Lord chose them because they wouldn't be able to practice witchcraft, at least in the
The same way.
internal way that the Egyptians had corrupted things.
Yeah.
Mr. Cooper?
I was just thinking that there's actually, you started off talking about how, the combination of things. It's influx according to the receiving vessel. And in those ancient days, by bringing certain physical objects together, you could call powers from, like we talked about in the book of Exodus. And those were actual things, where staff could become a snake. That kind of thing could happen. But the passages say that those correspondences were there because the Lord wasn't present in himself at that time. But when he took on his human, he took those representations to himself. So the only things that have that kind of power today are baptism and the Holy Supper. All the other powers of that kind of thing, that kind of magic, broke at that time. Which is why we read about stories about, in the old days we used to have magic, now we don't. It actually stopped when the Lord came into the world. But we still have enchantments.
And that's a form of
the kind
magic.
It's a different kind of thing where people use evil and perhaps encouragement by spirits and use people to encourage other people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And also some of those things about those magical things in Africa,
Right.
they discovered, for example, some of the things they call tukloshis, which are evil spirits that come in. Well, in some cases, basically what they do is they take a sharpened bicycle spoke and push it up somebody's rectum, and that kills them without any apparent exterior cause, and then the sorcerer or magician can take credit for it. It actually has a very physical,
Yikes.
it's very physical and it's very natural, not magical at all.
So what about,
I can talk to Willard about that.
what about cases of so from here it was talking about that there's certain kinds of obsessions. So with an obsession, is that your mind focusing an idea, but it's actually a spirit that's motivating that?
You're inviting the spirit to be there.
Okay.
You're opening your mind to it.
Or your mind or brain is disordered and therefore like
Well,
schizophrenia.
mostly we're talking about people who choose to start thinking about those things, or
Right.
also there's also the possibility of using substances that take away the safeguards. It's like, I read Dan Goodnote talked about, like LSD. He says, imagine what would happen. Remember the old stuff we used to put on Christmas trees, this tinsel, the chopped aluminum?
Yeah.
He says, imagine taking some of that and chewing it up with scissors so you had just a whole handful of chopped tinsel and throwing it onto the circuit board of a computer. You think what would happen. I used to have a lot of fun laying across my railroad tracks on my trips. But you think about the way a computer works, the way your brain works is really a computer, and the LSD has the effect of removing the insulating factor of the myelin sheath around each nerve. So the end result is when you take that medication, all those neural pathways you spent your whole lifetime putting together suddenly start short-circuiting. And all your paths go different ways because the insulation's gone. Now, it recovers after time.
For most.
But that's, but the thing is, what you've done is you've taken all these little things that have proteins that prevent electrical currents from going the wrong place, and basically thrown chopped aluminum into your brain.
I remember Wilson Van Dusen speaking about having done a lot of LSD,
Yeah.
and that he had a very difficult time. He spoke at once at Laurel, and I was there. Very difficult time just keeping his emotions from bursting into tears, basically, because, and he attributed it to the LSD, that it had broken down some of his ability to maintain. So he did a lot of recovery. I mean, he wrote some really, really powerful books, but I think there was always residual effects from having done that amount of LSD.
Well, the scary stuff was, back in the 60s, they were inviting people to take part in studies because they thought this was a medication that they could use to treat schizophrenia. And so they were inviting people to come in and take some. We'll do a test. It's all, it's like going in to test an arthritis drug. Here we got this wonderful drug. We'd like you to test it. And they were inviting people to come in.
Ken Casey and the Wanderer and
Oh, yeah.
the Grateful Dead started off with those Kool-Aid tests, et cetera, et cetera.
What was speed? Was that LSD or was that?
No, that's methamphetamine.
Yes,
Methamphetamine.
But,
Remember they used to talk about people that have a bad trip, that they lose their mind, never come back.
well, I think Dan Buddha's final point about all this was that by breaking down those barriers that have been built into your mind, that allows spirits to get past the barriers that are built there. And that's where this whole magical thing and insanity comes from.
So that's an interesting point that you just made, because I remember I was doing a little bit of reading on that particular topic as well, and I came across the topic of synesthesia, which I might be saying it wrong, but the idea is that you can taste sounds, or you can basically the connections in your brain that are designed to go a certain way go a different way, and then you can start to experience like what else would it be? Like basically just imagine switching the sensory input to two different things. Colors have flavor, that kind of thing. But
purple.
But I guess my question would be, so if the brain is just a machine, and we're just and all that's and this LSD is just rerouting these circuits, how is the circuit being rerouted to allow for a spirit to come in? That's kind of interesting to me. Unless the LSD was also doing something in a spiritual realm, like that maybe I am like that idea of giving license to an evil spirit, like I'm willingly damaging my brain, and that is something an evil spirit would like, so then that draws them near, or something like that.
Well, maybe a simpler model for that is the writers talk a few times about when you're sick, like an upset stomach or something, you have bad dreams. So whenever the body's ill and out of physical order,
Spiritual.
the corresponding disorder in the spiritual world, because everything in this world represents something in the other world. The body in an orderly state represents good, so good spirits are there. When it's in a disordered state because of the flu, because of bad food you ate, because of LSD, it doesn't matter. When you mess up the physical receptor, corresponding evil spirits are drawn to that. Which is sometimes why your mood when you got the flu and that is just you feel lousy, you don't feel like yourself.
Receiving vessel.
Not just
Yeah, your normal good loves aren't present, you just don't feel like doing anything. And usually you hate being like that because you're normally in a good state, but it's influxes according to receiving vessel.
Sometimes you actually have hallucinations.
Yeah, fever gives
Fever and
which is a
hallucinations
perfect
go with it.
example of
I mean,
LSD.
I had a little bit of hallucinations when I was, had my first general anesthetic when I was 7 years old.
Yeah, we do it at 7, because your brain's not fully formed. So you're not inviting anything, it's just that
But
Oh, well, in a way, it's kind of inviting it.
the
You
natural
start taking-
defenses go
Well,
away.
you don't cause the disease is the point.
Oh,
You
okay,
don't
I
choose
see.
it.
Yeah,
yeah,
understood.
most of us don't choose to get the flu.
Kellen?
Oh, well, don't you invite it if you take a drug, and then that's your conscious choice to invite evil. They'll break the barriers down, and you'll be susceptible to evil spirits. And then if you get the flu, that's something completely outside of your control. And yet, it seems like because of influx, according to
Receiving vessel.
yeah, that the same evil spirits come in even when something is outside your conscious control. So it doesn't even seem like morality is even tied to whether or not evil spirits get inside your
There's
mind.
a different kind of influx. When you're sick and you're having funny dreams, that's one thing. When you take drugs, it causes you to behave in a different way. That's a different thing. Or when you're inviting, when you're consciously choosing a change. And it's different from just funny dreams.
Well, I think Dave was in front of me, go ahead.
I just want to take this opportunity to say something really goofy.
You already did.
I'm shocked.
I'm really fascinated with this idea of the neural network and the path, the spiritual path. Because, it's almost like the brain in its constitution and how it's formed, and in order to keep us within a perception of reality that we can function in. And, I think Aldous Huxley once wrote an article called "Is the Brain a Generator or a Reducing Valve?" And he felt that it was actually a reducing valve, because if life comes in from outside, and our brain is wired in such a way so that our consciousness is presented with reality in a way that we can handle it. We don't generate our own consciousness. But if that valve cracks open a little bit too much and we get exposed to too much reality, then, weird things happen. But this notion of the spiritual path is very central, I think, to shamanism. That there are pathways in the spiritual world. And I think it's really interesting and fascinating, this is the goofy thing, to compare that with neural networks. And where I saw that was flying over Nazca in Peru, where all these lines are just running through the desert.
You did a talk about that.
Yeah. But they also converged, like spokes on a wheel. And when you flew over it, I know this sounds weird, but I'm looking down, we're all at this, and they always converged on a mound. So wherever the lines crossed, like spokes on a wheel, it was at a kind of a mound. It almost, for the air, it almost looks like it was growing, or glowing, I should say. But in any case, that could be an optical illusion. But just, I wonder, what did these people do? Why did they do this? It almost looks like the plane of Nazca is just a brain map.
Or it's an LSD trip.
Where, and where each of the figures are correspondential representations of certain elements or aspects of function that are attributed to the brain, or to consciousness.
Yeah, I saw a really cool TED Talk actually dealing with a similar kind of idea, but it was with villages in Africa. There's these certain tribes, and what they do is that they will build villages in the form of fractals, so that the big village, inside of that is a smaller village, inside of that's a smaller village, to the point where at the very center they have basically a dollhouse with figurine, little people inside. And I guess what I thought was interesting about that is, first of all, some of these fractals that they were doing were quite complex. And the guy who was researching this was using computers and stuff to figure things out. And the idea that was kind of interesting is, why did they do it, and how did they figure that out? And maybe it's the idea that of that grand man, where there's a grand man, we're a part of that, and then we are also a man, and that they're trying to replicate something similar to that in the way that they're building their houses. Michael Callie?
I was going to talk about the idea of sleep deprivation for brainwashing, similar type of thing, and also the sensory deprivation tanks that people got experimenting with. So there's so many different channels into the upset of the balance of consciousness and the influence of the spirits that are always with us, and what keeps that barrier, that thin veil in place, and sometimes that veil is removed, which is what Halloween is all about, is the veil between the two worlds is supposed to be thinnest on this night, Halloween night, and on the other side of the season of light comes May 1st. So witchcraft or earth-based religions have been observing these two evenings as the most sacred, and that it's Halloween, it's the evening of the most hallowed day of All Saints' Day, but the Christian church just stole the already popular time and made it Christianized, which is what most of our Christian holidays are things from ancient church, or
like cutting down a tree.
Yeah, a lot of those things. A great book by a man named Fraser called The Golden Bough that really goes into all of that kind of material. But that, whether it's tinsel on a computer thing, whatever image we use, there's so many different ways that spirits could take advantage of us. And the heat of passion is spoken of in conjugal love, that things aren't imputed to people if they basically lose their mind because they're overpowered with lust. Whether it's the lust that comes from your own testosterone or some other drug, whether you've chosen it or not chosen it, I mean, we're very vulnerable. So messing with this stuff, as fun as it can sound, is really dangerous.
Has consequences.
That's all I have. I mean, that's not all I have to say, but I'll talk about it for days.
I think, yeah.
I was just going to mention, because of my wife being from Ireland, the ancient Celtic world, they must have had some residual knowledge of correspondences, because they believed there were spirits in nature, like in trees and that, and you had this sort of and the First Nations here too, they behave in such a way that you don't upset the spirits that are present within the natural. And animals and stuff too, each animal had a spirit. Like you see that in Last of the Mohicans where he shoots the deer for food, but then he apologizes for having to take his life, and so on and so forth. And some of their traditions, which we would call witchcraft, but they were druids, was they had some knowledge of the other world and of the evil in the other world and the dangers of it. So they would tell people how to protect themselves against that, because of course, one of the things the Lord had to do when he came was people were able to be possessed by spirits. And so the druids would help guard against that stuff and tell people what to do to not go there. And Halloween was a dangerous time, so you'd put a pumpkin out or something carved like a head, so if the evil spirits came by, they'd take that instead of killing one of your members of your family or your tribe or whatever. So unlike some of the distortions in the modern world, it's more, and of course the druids were also the ones who knew medicine, and knew which plants healed what and stuff. And that knowledge was very important for survival. But the key was whether you use it for the good of the group and the others and to protect from evil, or whether you started to use it for putting a curse on somebody or doing bad stuff. And of course, when you do it for the sake of the use, there's a protection from the Lord in doing anything you do for the sake of the use, for the sake of good, for protection from evil. So, but nowadays we have more knowledge because of the Bible and stuff.
Well, thank you. Yes?
One last factoid for me is that the membership in Scientology is about 10 times higher than that in the general church. So just digest that one.
There you go. The wrap up on the whole thing is when you hear bad news and when you see bad news, be governed accordingly.
Use your head.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, George.
Yeah,